The city glimmered beneath a hush of falling snow, each flake illuminated by the golden glow of Christmas lights. Shoppers hurried beneath scarves and laughter, their arms full of promise wrapped in red and gold. Somewhere amid the noise and cheer, Edward Langford moved like a ghost, through it all polished shoes, tailored coat, and the faint scent of cedar and distance. He had everything a man could buy, everything except someone to share it with. Inside Langford Plaza, the luxury shopping complex he owned but rarely visited, holiday music drifted softly through hidden speakers. The polished marble floors mirrored his reflection as he walked, phone in hand, murmuring to his assistant about end-of-year donations. His words were efficient, detached, as though the act of giving were merely another transaction to complete before his flight to Switzerland. "Sir," the assistant said through his earpiece, "should I confirm your attendance at the gala on Christmas Eve?" Edward hesitated by the window, watching a young couple press their noses to a toy store display. The woman laughed. The man slipped his arm around her shoulders, both glowing with a simple joy that pierced him in a way he couldn't name. "No," he said quietly. "Send my apologies." He ended the call. The reflection, staring back at him, was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and hollow-eyed. He turned away. Across town, in a smaller corner of the same city, Maggie Hayes was closing her bookshop for the night. Second Chapter had survived decades of rent hikes, storms, and thinning crowds. Its windows glowed with warmth, garlands woven with tiny lights, a tree decorated with paper ornaments customers had written their wishes on. Maggie touched one, a child's scrawl read, "I wish Mum would smile again." She smiled sadly. Her life was quiet. A modest flat above the shop, a cat named Henry, and memories of a husband gone too soon. Yet there was peace in her routines. Tea at dawn, books and strangers' stories by day, candlelight and soft radio carols by night. She locked the door and watched the snow begin to fall heavier now, flakes settling like forgiveness on the cobblestones. Christmas, she always said, was for remembering the good, even when the good had gone. The following morning, Edward's driver slowed near the plaza's entrance. "Crowds will be terrible today, sir," he said, glancing in the mirror. Edward looked out at the bustle, the carols, the red and green chaos of December 23rd. He should have sent someone else, but something in him, something restless, wanted to feel Christmas again, if only for an hour. "Park around the corner," he said. "I'll walk." Stepping into the cold, he drew his scarf tighter. People brushed past him, their laughter mingling with the smell of roasted chestnuts and pine. The weight of their joy pressed against his solitude like sunlight through a locked window. Inside the department store, the glitter of ornaments and perfume displays overwhelmed his senses. He passed through aisles lined with everything money could buy: gold watches, silk scarves, limited edition whiskey. But none of it felt real. Then, near a crowded table of Christmas cards, he noticed something strange. A woman, slightly older than the rest of the crowd, was sorting through the pile with deliberate care, reading each one before setting it down. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't buying. She was simply feeling. Maggie. He didn't know her name yet, but something about her stillness drew him a quiet authenticity in a world too loud. Her gloves were threadbare, her coat modest, but her face carried a kind of soft strength, lined not by age but by kindness well practiced. As she reached for a card, a small boy darted past, bumping the table. The pile toppled. Cards scattered like snow. Edward's reflexes caught him, but not before a flurry of paper brushed against Maggie's face. "Oh, goodness," she gasped, laughing softly as she bent to gather them. "Looks like Christmas exploded." Edward knelt beside her, his expensive gloves brushing against the cheap cardstock. "Allow me," he said, his tone formal, too formal. Maggie glanced up, amused. "Thank you, but I believe gravity did most of the work already." He looked at her then, really looked at the lines by her eyes, the calm humor there. It disarmed him. "You should sue gravity," he murmured. "It has no respect for the season." She chuckled. "And deprive it of its fun? Never." They gathered the cards in silence. He stood first and offered her a hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her palm was warm, despite the chill. When she straightened, a store clerk called out, "Miss Hayes, your donation box is ready." "Thank you," Maggie replied, smiling. "Donation box?" Edward's brow furrowed slightly. He watched as she walked to the counter, where the clerk handed her a small box of books and envelopes labeled for a local shelter. She thanked him, tucking a stray wisp of hair behind her ear before heading toward the exit. He could have left it there, but something in him followed. Outside, the snow had thickened. Maggie struggled to balance the box and her umbrella. Edward, feeling inexplicably compelled, stepped forward. "Allow me," he said. She turned, surprised but not unkind. "You again? Are you sure you want to risk another encounter with gravity?" He smiled faintly. "I've had worse business partners." Her laughter came easy, warm enough to melt the air between them. "All right then, just to the corner." They walked together, slowly. The crowd rushed around them, hurrying, buying, haggling. But in that small pocket of space and falling snow, time seemed to still. At the corner, she nodded toward the small church hall. "They host a Christmas Eve dinner there every year. I help with books for the children. Some of them haven't much to open." He nodded, words caught somewhere behind his reserve. "You should come," she said, eyes bright with gentle insistence. "Even billionaires need a little Christmas spirit, don't they?" He froze. "How did you?" "Hey." She gestured toward his watch, his coat, his air. "You wear it like a name tag," she said kindly. "But don't worry, I won't hold it against you." And with that, she crossed the street, disappearing into the white. Edward stood there, the snow settling on his coat like ash and grace. For the first time in years, he felt something stir, something small, fragile, and alive. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was hope. Have you ever met someone by pure chance who left a lasting mark on your heart? Tell us your story in the comments. I'd love to know. The next day dawned gray and soft, the kind of December morning when the world seems made of breath and memory. Edward Langford sat in his penthouse overlooking the river, untouched breakfast cooling beside him. His assistant had sent reminders, messages, and updates all ignored. He couldn't stop thinking about her. The woman from the store, Maggie Hayes. It wasn't infatuation, it was curiosity, that rare ache that reached beneath the skin of routine. Who was she? This woman who spoke to him as if money meant nothing, who could laugh in the middle of chaos, hold a box of charity books, and somehow leave him feeling poorer for all he owned. He rose, restless, and crossed the room to the window. The city stretched below like a snow-covered circuit board, bright, cold, mechanical. For the first time in years, it looked lonely. He exhaled softly and whispered, "What are you doing to me, Maggie Hayes?" Across town, Maggie stacked books at the shelter's reading room. The volunteers buzzed around her, hanging tinsel, arranging tables for the Christmas Eve dinner. Children's laughter echoed down the hall, mingling with the clatter of dishes. "Need help with those?" asked Ruth, the elderly volunteer beside her. Maggie smiled. "Only if you promise not to sneak another shortbread." Ruth grinned guiltily, crumbs at the corner of her mouth. "You're too observant, dear. It's unnerving." Maggie laughed. "Comes with owning a bookstore. I read people like covers." "Then what do you say your story is?" Ruth asked. "Oh, probably a well-loved copy. A bit dog-eared, but still readable." That personifications, Ruth's gaze softened. "Maybe ready for a sequel?" Maggie's hand stilled on the stack of books. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Some stories are meant to end." That afternoon, Edward's car rolled to a stop once more outside the same shopping district. "Are you sure about this, sir?" his driver asked. "No meetings today," Edward replied. "Just personal errands." Inside the store, the decorations had grown even more elaborate overnight. He moved without direction, trailing through aisles, as though memory itself guided him. His eyes scanned faces until he saw her. At the customer service counter, Maggie stood waiting with a small bag, chatting with the clerk. Her hair, touched by the light snow, caught the glow of the chandeliers. She wore no perfume, no diamonds, just the simple beauty of someone comfortable in her own skin. Before he could think, he was walking toward her. "Maggie Hayes," he said softly. She turned, surprised. "Mr. Langford?" she said, recognizing him with a smile that was more amused than impressed. "Did gravity throw something at you again?" He smiled genuinely, this time. "Not yet, but I came prepared to negotiate." Her laughter was quiet, the kind that fills the spaces words can't reach. "What brings you here?" she asked. "Regret, mostly," he said, before realizing how honest that sounded. "And maybe curiosity." "Well, that's a dangerous combination," she teased. "You might leave with something you didn't plan to buy." He tilted his head. "That wouldn't be the worst outcome." They fell into an unexpected rhythm, soft conversation between strangers, who somehow felt familiar. When the clerk handed her the bag, she nodded to Edward. "Charity books again. The shelter's library is small, but the kids don't mind." He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out his checkbook, an old habit of power. "Perhaps I can help expand it." Her smile faded. "That's kind, but unnecessary. I can afford to be generous," he insisted lightly. "Yes," she said, "but generosity isn't about affording, it's about feeling." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was a mirror. He closed the checkbook slowly, something shifting in his chest. She sighed, softening. "You could help, though. We're short on hands for tomorrow's preparations." He blinked. "You mean manual labor?" "I mean human presence," she said simply. "You remember what that is, don't you?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just honest. It startled him more than anger could have, and before he could answer, she smiled again. "We start at 10. You'll find us at the church hall." And just like that, she walked away, leaving him standing beneath the glow of artificial stars and distant carols, feeling more alive than he had in years. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He poured himself a drink, then left it untouched. The fireplace flickered, casting light on the framed photo of his late wife, Catherine. He sat before it, the silence vast. "Do you see this, Kath?" he murmured. "A stranger invites me to a church hall, and I can't even say no." His voice cracked, surprising him. The grief had dulled long ago, but something in Maggie's voice had pressed on the old wound, not to hurt, but to heal. He took a deep breath. "Maybe it's time," he whispered. Outside, the snow fell thicker, as if the world itself were preparing to start again. The next morning, Maggie arrived early at the hall. The place smelled of cinnamon and pine. Volunteers unpacked boxes, strung lights, set up tables. She rubbed her hands for warmth, wondering if she'd been foolish to invite him. Men like Edward Langford didn't just show up, but an hour later, a black car pulled up at the curb. He stepped out, no assistant, no entourage, just a man in a long, dark coat carrying 2 boxes of wrapped gifts. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," she said, smiling. "Neither was I," he admitted. "But apparently gravity's persistent." Her laugh, warm, genuine, was all the reward he needed. "Come in, then. We'll find you a proper introduction to humanity." He chuckled, following her inside, and for the first time in years, the weight of his own name began to feel lighter. By noon, they worked side by side, hanging garlands and sorting gifts. Edward's hands, accustomed to signing contracts and holding crystal glasses, fumbled with ribbons and tape. Maggie watched, amused. "You're overthinking it," she said, guiding his hand. "It's wrapping paper, not a stock report." He looked at her close enough now to smell her faint lavender soap. "I haven't done this in years," he confessed. "Not since my wife." He stopped, unsure why the words escaped. Maggie's voice softened. "Then maybe it's time you did again." He nodded, eyes meeting hers, and something gentle, uncertain, began to bloom. When the last gift was wrapped, Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. "You did well, Mr. Langford. Edward, he corrected quietly. If we're going to be friends, I'd prefer you use it. She smiled. Friends, then, and for the first time that season, he believed in Christmas again. Do you believe second chances can happen when we least expect them? Tell us in the comments. Has a stranger ever restored your faith in something you'd lost? The morning after the charity work, Edward woke to the sound of distant bells. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming, until he realized he hadn't closed the terrace doors. The winter wind carried the faint hum of carolers from the square below, their harmonies fragile as glass. He stood at the window, watching as the city glowed beneath the pale light. The same city he'd built towers in, invested in, conquered, but never belonged to. And now, one woman with kind eyes and a tired coat had unsettled the empire of his solitude. He tried to shake it off. There were calls to make, accounts to review, 1,000 ways to distract himself from the echo of her laughter. Yet every sound in his penthouse, the hum of the heating, the click of his watch, even the creak of leather beneath him, felt hollow. When his assistant entered, balancing a tray of coffee and reports, Edward said abruptly, "Cancel the Zurich meeting." "Sir?" "Just do it," Edward murmured. "I need to stay in the city a few more days. Buddy Allen. Just do it way. Debt, 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 debt." Across town, the bookshop smelled of pine and paper. Maggie stood behind the counter, wrapping a small parcel for a customer. Her hands moved automatically, but her mind wandered back to the image of Edward struggling with ribbon at the shelter, his fingers clumsy, his smile boyish and unguarded. "Margaret?" The customer's voice startled her. "Are you all right?" She blinked, smiled. "Yes, of course. Just thinking about," she caught herself, "about a Christmas menu." The woman grinned knowingly. "Well, whoever he is, he must be special." Maggie laughed. "He's complicated." "Ah," the woman said. "Aren't they all?" After she left, Maggie leaned on the counter, sighing. Complicated was the right word. Edward Langford wasn't the kind of man who belonged in her world. He was polished marble. She was weathered wood. He was boardrooms and flights. She was teapots and used novels. And yet, when he smiled, she'd seen something human flicker behind the polish like the glow of a candle glimpsed through frosted glass. That evening, Edward walked alone through the Christmas market near the square. Children tugged at their parents' hands, the air filled with cinnamon, roasted nuts, and music. He watched them with a kind of aching envy. He had everything he'd ever wanted, but no one to share these small, beautiful things with. At a stall selling handmade ornaments, he picked up a tiny wooden angel. The seller, an elderly woman with a gentle accent, smiled. "Made by my grandson," she said, "for those who have someone watching over them." Edward hesitated. "And for those who don't?" Her eyes softened. "Then, perhaps it watches over them until they find someone again." He bought it, without knowing why. Later, he found himself walking toward the old church hall, the one Maggie had mentioned. Lights still glowed faintly inside. He peeked through the frosted glass door and saw her wiping tables, laughing with the children, moving through the room like someone born of kindness itself. He stood there for a long time, hidden, just watching. He could have gone in. He could have said hello. But something held him back. Not pride, not fear, but the fragile beauty of that distance. He wasn't ready to risk breaking it yet. He turned away, slipping the angel ornament into his pocket. The next day, Maggie found an envelope slipped through the bookshop door. No name, no note, only a delicate wooden angel tied with red ribbon and a single line written in careful script, "For those who still believe." She smiled, her chest tightening in a way that frightened her, the kind of ache that feels like hope daring to return. She placed the angel on the shop's Christmas tree, right at the center, where the light touched it best. Edward, meanwhile, sat in his study, staring at the same words scribbled in his notebook, "For those who still believe." He wasn't sure if he did. Not yet, but maybe he wanted to. He picked up the phone, stared at Maggie's number written on a scrap of paper from the donation ledger, then set it back down. What would he say? I'm a lonely man who can't stop thinking about your laughter? No, that wasn't his language. Instead, he opened his calendar and canceled his entire holiday schedule. For the first time in decades, Christmas would not be spent in a boardroom, but in a city wrapped in snow. The same city where a woman named Maggie Hayes had unknowingly rearranged his world. That night, Maggie met with her friend Ruth at the cafe by the river. So, Ruth said, stirring her tea, this man, are you seeing him again? Maggie sighed. He's someone I met by accident. End quote. Ruth smiled, eyes twinkling. Accidents make the best stories. He's kind, I think, Maggie admitted, but he's built a wall so high around himself that I'm not sure anyone could climb it. Then maybe, Ruth said softly, he's waiting for someone who doesn't need to climb. Someone who'll simply stand outside the wall until he opens the gate himself. Maggie stared out at the snowy river, lost in thought. Maybe. Christmas Eve approached. The city became a painting, street lamps glowing gold, snow softening every sound. Edward dressed quietly that morning, choosing a simple wool coat instead of his usual tailored armor. No driver, no fanfare. He carried a single gift under his arm, a first edition of A Christmas Carol, wrapped in brown paper. And though he didn't know it yet, he was walking toward the next chapter of his life. Have you ever kept yourself from reaching out to someone, only to wonder what might have happened if you had? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, the smallest choices make the biggest stories. The day before Christmas Eve dawned, bright but brittle, sunlight flashing like glass off the frozen rooftops. The city was alive, shoppers hurrying, carolers singing, bells ringing from distant church towers. Edward Langford stood before his mirror, adjusting a plain black tie. He'd forgotten how strange it felt to prepare for something that wasn't business. His assistant had begged him to attend the annual Langford Foundation Charity Gala, an event he'd hosted for years, yet never experienced. Tonight, for the first time, he intended to show up not as a benefactor, but as a man among people. He slipped the small wrapped book, A Christmas Carol, into his coat pocket. Not as a symbol of power, but of intention. A reminder of what could still be mended. The ballroom of the Langford Hotel gleamed with chandeliers and golden wreaths, filled with the hum of polite laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. The city's elite mingled in designer suits and glittering gowns, each gesture choreographed by habit. Edward entered quietly, heads turned, whispers rippled, but he didn't linger. He had come not for them, but for something, someone he couldn't name without smiling. Across the room, he caught sight of her, Maggie Hayes. She was there, to his astonishment, standing near the charity auction table, dressed in a simple navy blue dress that somehow outshone all the sequins in the room. Her volunteer badge gleamed against the fabric, and she looked slightly out of place among the crowd of donors and dignitaries. He felt something warm rise in his chest, a mix of surprise, admiration, and the quiet recognition of fate's humor. Before he could approach, the event coordinator intercepted him. Mr. Langford, if you'd join us at the stage for the opening remarks. He nodded politely but excused himself, eyes still fixed on Maggie. When he reached her, she looked up, startled then smiled. Well, she said, I suppose even billionaires can take volunteer shifts. He chuckled softly. I didn't expect to find you here. Same could be said of you, she replied. Ruth told me they needed extra hands at the donation table. I said yes before realizing it was your event. Fate has a mischievous streak, he murmured. Or maybe it's testing us, she countered. Eyes twinkling, they worked side by side through the evening, organizing bid sheets, greeting guests, and collecting donations. Maggie handled each interaction with grace, smiling, listening, making every guest feel seen. Edward watched her, quietly humbled. At one point, an elderly man approached and pressed a folded check into Maggie's hand. For the children, he said. She smiled. Thank you, sir. They'll love you for it. Thank you for watching. Love. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. When he walked away, Edward said softly, "You make people feel like their kindness matters." "It does matter," she said, glancing up. "Money can help, but people's hearts build the world, Edward." He fell silent, struck by the sincerity in her voice. Later that night, as the music swelled and couples took to the dance floor, Edward stood near the balcony, watching the snow drift beyond the glass. Maggie joined him, carrying 2 cups of cider. She offered him one. "You look like a man hiding from his own party." "Perhaps I am," he said. "I never liked gatherings that feel like transactions." She sipped her drink. "Then why host them?" He hesitated. "Once, it felt like purpose. Now, I'm not sure." She studied him, her eyes soft but discerning. "You could turn it into something else, you know. Less spectacle, more soul." He smiled faintly. "And what would that look like?" "Maybe," she said, "a place where people come not to donate, but to belong. Where no one's name is printed on the banner, just their hearts in the room." He turned toward her, something unspoken in his gaze. "You talk like someone who's lost a lot, but never lost faith." She laughed quietly. "Oh, I've lost plenty. But faith, that's the one thing I can't seem to shake." Their eyes met steady, lingering, and the noise of the ballroom seemed to fall away. For a heartbeat, there was only the 2 of them, framed by the glow of Christmas lights and the soft hush of falling snow beyond the glass. "Would you dance?" he asked. Maggie blinked, taken aback. "I haven't danced in years." "Neither have I," he said. "Perhaps we can fumble together." She hesitated, then nodded. He led her gently onto the floor. The orchestra shifted into a slow waltz, the kind that made time stretch like memory. His hand rested lightly against her back, hers in his. Their movements uncertain at first, but soon finding rhythm. She laughed softly. "You're not half bad. Don't spread that around," he said, smiling. "I have a reputation for being emotionally unavailable." Her laughter turned into something quieter, an exhale, almost a sigh. "Maybe that reputation is overdue for revision." In 24 2/17s, for a moment, Edward forgot the audience, the glitter, the years he'd spent behind invisible walls. All he saw was her Maggie Hayes, eyes full of light, heart open in a world that had long forgotten gentleness. When the song ended, applause rippled faintly around them. They stepped apart, reluctant but smiling. "I should go," she said, gathering her coat. "Early morning tomorrow." He nodded, though disappointment brushed his expression. "Thank you for not saying no. We free 70s as on team." The race ode, by free sewed, we free sewed. They were publicly, they were by free sewed. In the mentor, for the dance, for everything, he said softly. She touched his arm, brief, tender. "You're welcome, Edward. Merry Christmas Eve." And then she was gone. He stood in the crowd's glow, her absence echoing louder than the music. For the first time in decades, Edward Langford realized that no amount of wealth could match the quiet ache of watching someone walk away. Outside, Maggie paused beneath the falling snow. Her breath rose in white clouds, heart thudding against her ribs. She didn't know what this was, friendship, chance, or something deeper, but she knew it had stirred something long dormant within her, the courage to hope again. As she walked away, the church bells began to ring midnight. Christmas Eve had arrived. The snow fell steadily through the night, a soft curtain between the world and its memories. Christmas Eve morning arrived quiet and pale, the kind of morning that felt like a held breath. In his penthouse overlooking the river, Edward Langford sat with a cup of black coffee untouched before him. The city below shimmered with holiday life, children's laughter, bells, the scent of bread from the bakery across the street. But all of it seemed distant, muffled by memory. He turned the small wooden angel in his hands, the one he'd bought at the market. It caught the light gently, its carved wings imperfect, its paint chipped near the edge. Somehow, he found comfort in that. Imperfection. He rose, walked to his desk, and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside were photos, letters, small relics of a life before loss. One picture stopped him. His wife, Catherine, laughing beside a Christmas tree, her hair a tumble of gold and shadow. It had been taken the year before the accident. The year the car spun out on the icy road. The year his heart turned to stone. He'd built an empire after that, not from ambition, but from grief. Every tower, every acquisition, every headline was a monument to what he'd lost. If he could control the world, maybe he could stop it from breaking again. But all he'd managed to build was distance. He set the photo down and whispered, "You'd like her, Kath. She's kind, unreasonably kind." The words trembled in the air, half a confession, half a prayer. Across town, in the small flat above the bookshop, Maggie Hayes stood by her window, watching the same snow drift past. The radio hummed softly. Bing Crosby, "I'll be home for Christmas." She smiled wistfully. The room smelled faintly of cinnamon and tea. On the wall hung a framed photograph of her late husband, Tom. He'd been a carpenter, hands always dusted with sawdust, laughter always warm. They'd met young, built a life of small comforts, the shop, the flat, quiet evenings. And then the illness came, slow but certain. Years of hospitals, hope, exhaustion. The December he died, the tree downstairs stood bare because she couldn't bear to decorate it alone. That was 5 years ago. Since then, she'd filled her days with service and stories, her nights with books and silence. The world saw her as cheerful, and she was, most days. But grief is a patient guest. It never really leaves. It simply learns to sit quietly in the corner. She turned from the window and whispered, "You'd like him, Tom. He's trying, even when he doesn't know how." That afternoon, the church hall bustled with preparation for the evening dinner. The scent of roasted ham and cinnamon drifted through the air, mingling with children's laughter. Volunteers moved like clockwork, placing gifts, setting tables, wrapping last-minute donations. Edward arrived quietly, no chauffeur, no entourage, just himself and a small box under his arm. When Maggie saw him, her face lit with something between surprise and quiet joy. "You came," he smiled. "You invited me." "I didn't think you'd listen." "Neither did I," he said, and she laughed softly. He placed the box on the donations table. "Books," he explained, "for the children's library." Her eyes softened. "Thank you. They'll love that." They worked side by side, hanging garlands, arranging chairs. The rhythm between them had become natural pauses filled with warmth, silences charged with understanding. At one point, Maggie stepped outside for air. The evening light cast everything in amber and snow. Edward followed a few minutes later, standing beside her, beneath the church awning. "It's beautiful," she said. "Christmas Eve always feels like a promise, or a memory," he murmured. She looked at him. "You sound like a man who's haunted." He smiled faintly. "You wouldn't be wrong." The quiet stretched, soft and alive. Finally, he said, "My wife died 15 years ago. Christmas night. We were driving home from a charity event. The roads were slick. I told her I'd handle it." His voice broke slightly. "I didn't." Maggie didn't speak. She simply reached out, covering his gloved hand with hers. He swallowed. "Since then, I've tried to fill the silence with things, work, money, but nothing reaches the place she left empty." Her eyes glistened. "Grief doesn't leave," she said gently. "It just learns to whisper instead of scream." He looked at her, searching her face. "And what does it whisper to you, Maggie Hayes?" She smiled faintly. "That love is still worth the ache." The church bells began to toll softly in the distance. marking the hour. The sound seemed to wrap around them like a benediction. "Tell me about him," Edward said quietly. "The man you loved. Tell me about him. The man you loved." She hesitated, then nodded. "Tom. He was steady, gentle. We built the shop together. He used to carve little wooden birds for the shelves. Said they kept the stories company." Edward smiled. He sounds like the kind of man who understood enough not to say too much. She laughed softly. Exactly. He didn't have to fill silence. He just shared it. They stood together, the snow thickening, time slowing, until the only sound was breath and bells. "Finally," Edward said, "I thought I'd close that part of my heart forever, but now." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Maggie looked up at him, truly looked, and something inside her trembled like thawing ice. When they went back inside, the hall was alive with joy, laughter, warmth, music. Edward found himself smiling without effort, kneeling beside children as they unwrapped gifts, listening as Maggie read aloud from a storybook. It was A Christmas Carol. Her voice carried gently over the crowd. "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year." Their eyes met across the room, and in that look was something wordless but unmistakable. Healing. Later, as the guests began to leave, Edward handed Maggie the wrapped first edition he'd carried all week. "For you," he said softly. "It's an old copy. A bit worn, but it seemed right." She unwrapped it carefully, eyes widening. "Edward, this must be worth." He shook his head. "No. It's only worth what it means." She opened the cover and found an inscription in his handwriting. "For the one who reminded me that hearts can be rebuilt even in winter." Tears shimmered at the edge of her lashes. "Edward," he smiled gently. "Merry Christmas, Maggie." Outside, the church bells rang midnight again. The snow glowed under lamplight, and for the first time in years, Edward Langford felt not empty, but alive. Beside him, Maggie slipped her hand into his quietly, naturally, as though it had always belonged there. No declarations, no grand gesture, just two souls who had stopped running from the past long enough to walk into the present together. Christmas morning arrived like a whisper. The city lay hushed under a fresh quilt of snow, every street softened, every sound muted, as though the world itself were holding its breath. For once, Edward Langford did not wake to the buzz of his phone or the weight of an itinerary. He woke to silence. And in that silence, for the first time in 15 years, he felt peace. The fire had burned low in the grate. On the coffee table sat a note written in his own careful hand before dawn. "Go where the warmth is. Gonen." End quote. He smiled faintly, slipped on his coat, and stepped into the winter light. Across town, the church bells rang for early service. Maggie Hayes stood outside the bookshop, mug of tea in hand, watching her street shimmer in the glow of morning. The window display she'd built for the holiday stories for the heart glistened with frost. Inside, the angel ornament Edward had given her hung from the small Christmas tree, its wooden wings catching the light like hope itself. She had not expected to see him again so soon. After last night, the laughter, the tears, the gift she had accepted, that it might have been a moment suspended in time, beautiful and brief. But then, as she turned the sign to "Closed for Christmas," she saw him, Edward, walking down the quiet street, gloved hands in his coat pockets, snow dusting his hair. Her heart stuttered once, not from surprise, but recognition. "You found your way here," she said as he reached her door. "I followed the smell of cinnamon," he replied, smiling. "Or maybe grace. Flattery before breakfast," she teased. "Dangerous combination," He nodded toward the bookshop window. I see the angel has a home. She followed his gaze. Yes, it's strange the light always catches it, even when the sun shouldn't reach this side. Maybe it knows where to shine, he said quietly. They walked together, slow and unhurried, through the snow-dusted park nearby. Bare trees stretched like lace against the pale sky, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Every step crunched softly beneath them, a rhythm as steady as their breath. It feels different this year, she said. Usually I wake up missing him, Tom. The ache comes before the coffee. But today, she hesitated, smiling at her own vulnerability. Today I felt something lighter, as if he'd nodded, you know? As if he'd said, go on, love. Edward looked at her, his expression tender. Maybe he did. She glanced at him. And you? How does Christmas feel after all this time? He exhaled, slowly. Like I'm finally living in it, instead of observing it through glass. They stopped near a frozen pond where children were skating, their laughter ringing through the cold air. A young boy stumbled. His mother rushed to lift him, her laughter bright and easy. Edward watched, eyes softening. She looks like Catherine, he murmured, the way she leans into joy without noticing it. Maggie touched his sleeve gently. Then maybe you should lean into yours. He looked at her hand, small, steady, real, and something inside him gave way. They found a bench near the pond and sat quietly. A faint sun broke through the clouds, gilding everything in pale gold. I never thought I'd have this again, Edward said. Peace. Companionship. It feels like borrowing light from a world I'd stopped believing in. Maggie smiled. Then keep it. Don't give it back. He turned to her. You make it sound so easy. Love isn't easy, she said softly. But it's always simple. Her words lingered like the last note of a carol. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to her. What's this? She asked, curious. A lease agreement, he said, then added quickly at her raised eyebrow. Not for you for second chapter. Your landlord's been threatening to raise the rent again. Her eyes widened. How did you? He smiled. I have friends who talk too much. Don't worry, it's anonymous. No attention, no headlines. Just a quiet renewal at the same rate you've always paid. She blinked back tears. Edward, I can't accept that. You already have, he said gently. You gave me something I couldn't buy. I'm just returning a fraction of it. For a long moment, neither spoke. The snow fell softly around them, blanketing the world in silence and grace. Finally, Maggie whispered, You don't have to fix everything, you know. He smiled faintly. Old habits die hard. Then let this one fade with the snow, she said. You don't owe anyone redemption. You just have to live. They rose and began to walk again, following the curve of the park path until they reached a small bridge. The stream below was frozen, the ice glowing blue-white in the sunlight. Edward stopped and turned toward her. Do you believe, he asked quietly, that people can fall in love twice in one lifetime? She looked at him for a long moment before answering. I think people can learn to love differently each time. Softer, wiser, braver. He smiled. Then maybe that's what this is. Her eyes met his. Maybe. The silence that followed was not empty, it was sacred. And when he reached for her hand, she didn't hesitate. Their fingers intertwined easily, naturally, like something remembered rather than discovered. They spent the rest of the morning walking through the city, sharing stories of small things, favorite books, childhood Christmases, the foods they secretly hated but pretended to love. There was laughter, gentle teasing, moments when their hands brushed and neither pulled away. As they returned to her shop, the church bells began to ring again, not in mourning or memory this time, but in celebration. "Come in," she said. "I have soup on the stove." "And no man should spend Christmas alone, not even one with a penthouse." He smiled. "I'd rather be here anyway." Inside, the warmth wrapped around them like an embrace. The smell of tomato soup and freshly baked bread filled the air. Maggie set 2 bowls on the small table by the window, where the light fell on the wooden angel. As they ate, the snow outside thickened, cloaking the world in white. The shop felt like a sanctuary, timeless and still. When they finished, Edward looked around at the shelves of worn books, the cozy clutter, the life that pulsed quietly in every corner. "This place suits you," he said. "And you?" she asked, smiling. "Where do you belong?" He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "Here, I think, or anywhere you are." Maggie's smile faltered, then deepened the kind of smile that hides tears behind warmth. She reached across the table and touched his hand. "Then maybe we both found home again." Outside, the snowfall thickened, soft and endless. Inside, 2 people sat together in a small bookshop, sharing the quiet miracle of company proof that even the coldest winters can yield warmth if the heart remains willing. And as they watched the snow drift past the window, Maggie whispered, almost to herself, "Every year, I tell myself not to expect miracles." Edward's fingers tightened gently around hers. "Maybe this year," he said. "The miracle expected you." For 3 peaceful days after Christmas, the world seemed to conspire in their favor. Edward and Maggie settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary. Morning tea in the bookshop, afternoons walking by the frozen river, evenings by the fire, reading aloud from well-loved pages. It was not passion that defined them, but calm, the kind that comes when 2 lives finally breathe in the same tempo. Then the newspapers came. On the morning of the 28th, Maggie was sorting new donations when Ruth burst through the door, pale and breathless. "Maggie," she said, thrusting the paper forward, "you'd better see this." Across the front page, beneath a glossy photo of Edward standing beside a minister, were the words. The article painted him as a cunning businessman using his foundation to acquire sentimental properties for development. And though the details were twisted, one name stood out in the fine print. Second Chapter Books. Maggie read it twice, her stomach turning to stone. It didn't matter that she knew the man behind the headline. The image of corporate greed was louder than memory, older than trust. Ruth touched her arm. "Maybe it's a mistake." "No," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling. "It's exactly what people like him do." When Edward arrived that afternoon, the bell above the door jingled like an alarm. He smiled at first until he saw her face. "Maggie? What's wrong?" She held up the newspaper. "Is it true?" He took it, scanning the print, his brow tightening. "Not like this. The foundation bought leases to protect these shops, not to demolish them. I was trying to... This is... to help?" She cut in. You didn't tell me you owned them. You let me believe this place was safe because of goodwill, not paperwork. I thought anonymity would spare you the attention, he said quietly. It didn't spare me the humiliation, she replied. The silence that followed was heavy as snow on branches. Maggie, please. I did it for you for the shop, because I care. Her voice cracked. Don't say that. Don't turn kindness into ownership. He flinched, as if struck. You think I bought you? He asked, hurt surfacing in his tone. I think, she said slowly, you don't know how not to. The words hung between them, cruel only because they were true. He set the newspaper down, shoulders rigid. I thought you saw me for who I was. I did, she whispered. But maybe I wanted to see too much. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, carrying the first flakes of another storm. Inside, the warmth between them thinned into distance. Edward reached into his pocket, pulled out the small wooden angel she'd given back to him that morning for safekeeping. He placed it on the counter. Keep it, he said. You were right. It knows where to shine. Then he turned toward the door. Edward, she said, but too softly. He paused only long enough to whisper, I wanted to give Maggie. I never meant to take. The bell chimed as he left, and the door swung shut behind him. That night, the snow came hard. The city disappeared beneath white silence. Maggie sat in the darkened shop, lights off, fire cold. The newspaper lay open beside her tea, its ink bleeding slightly where her tears had fallen. She thought of calling him, of explaining, of listening, but pride has its own gravity. After years of loss, she had learned to protect herself first. Still, somewhere deep inside, she felt the old whisper of faith. Maybe he was telling the truth. Across the river, Edward paced his apartment, lights dim, phone in hand. Every instinct told him to fix it, to call lawyers, issue statements, buy silence. But this time, the problem wasn't the press. It was the look in her eyes, the loss of trust he'd barely earned. He poured a drink, didn't touch it, and stared out over the city. Catherine, he murmured, how did you keep faith when I always failed it? No answer came, only the soft reflection of snow against glass. He realized, then, that power couldn't protect him from the one thing he'd spent his life avoiding, being misunderstood by someone who mattered. By dawn, Maggie wrote a note she would never send. You said you wanted to give, not take. Maybe that's what love is, giving until you're misunderstood. I don't know if I can believe in us again, but I hope you're warm tonight. She folded it carefully, placed it inside a book on the counter, A Christmas Carol, and closed the cover. For the next 2 days, neither called. The city celebrated the new year, while two people sat in separate silences, both rehearsing apologies. Neither knew how to begin. Sometimes, love doesn't shatter in one moment. It just stops speaking. And when it finally breaks the silence, what's left to say decides everything. The New Year's wind pressed against Edward Langford's tall windows, carrying the echo of laughter from far below. The city glittered with fireworks still waiting to be lit, but inside his apartment, the silence was complete. He poured coffee he wouldn't drink and looked down at the folded newspaper on the table. The headline that had broken them apart stared back at him. He knew the words by heart now, but the sting lay in what Maggie had believed. Not the article itself, but the thought that he could ever use power to buy affection. He opened his desk drawer and took out the lease papers. Every clause had been written to protect her little bookshop, yet secrecy had turned it into a weapon. He could almost hear her voice. "You don't know how not to own things." She had been right. He sat for a long moment beneath the dim light, then drew a sheet of stationery and began to write, the pen moving slowly, deliberately. Maggie, I built walls disguised as generosity. You saw through them. The truth is simple. The foundation bought the leases to keep those shops alive, not to claim them. Yours now belongs to you alone. No contracts, no debts. This isn't charity, it's confession. I can't bear the distance between us. If forgiveness still lives somewhere in your heart, meet me at the bridge near your shop when the church clock strikes midnight. Edward. He sealed the envelope, shrugged on his coat, and stepped into the snow. The bookshop was dark, except for the glow of embers in the stove. She sat wrapped in a blanket, unable to read, listening to the hush that follows Christmas when the world waits for a new year to begin. She looked at the wooden angel hanging in the window and thought of him, the way he had smiled at children, the way he had said asterisk, "You make people feel like their kindness matters." Asterisk, pride had protected her all her life, yet tonight it felt cold and brittle. A knock startled her. At the door stood a courier, snow crusting his shoulders. "Delivery for Miss Hayes." She thanked him and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Edward's handwriting spilled across the page, steady, regretful, utterly human. When she reached the final line, asterisk, midnight, the bridge, asterisk, she looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. She pulled on her coat and stepped into the night. Snow drifted thick and slow over the river. Edward stood alone at the center of the bridge, collar turned up against the wind, letter copy folded in his pocket. The city beyond shimmered with half-lit fireworks, the air alive with waiting. Footsteps. He turned. Maggie approached through the falling snow, breath white in the cold, scarf trailing behind her. She stopped a few paces away, uncertain, beautiful in the pale light. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I almost didn't ask," he answered. They smiled, faintly, as the clock began to strike midnight. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I was afraid," he said quietly. "Afraid you'd see the man I used to be before I had the courage to change." She studied him. "And what makes you think I haven't been afraid, too?" "You were brave enough to love the world anyway," he said. "I forgot how." The last bell echoed across the river. Fireworks bloomed above them, painting her face in gold and silver. He took a slow step forward. "I don't want to fix you, Maggie," he whispered. "I just want to walk beside you." Her eyes softened. "Then walk." She moved into his arms. The snow swirled around them, and for a long, timeless moment, there was nothing but warmth, forgiveness, and the sound of the river beneath the ice. When they finally parted, Maggie smiled through her tears. "You realize this means I'll have to put another chair by the fire." He laughed, voice low and unguarded. "I'll bring the wood." "Bring yourself," she said. "That's enough. Bye. 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 Bye." Hand in hand, they crossed the bridge and walked back through the sleeping streets. The angel in her shop window caught the first burst of fireworks and glowed as if alive, its little wings spread wide over the new year. Some promises are spoken, others simply shine. Morning light spilled through the bookshop windows like forgiveness. The city, still wrapped in frost, was beginning to wake after the New Year's revelry. Bells echoed faintly from the cathedral across the river. Maggie set 2 mugs of tea on the counter. Steam curled upward, soft and fragrant. She smiled as she heard the familiar creak of the front door. Edward stepped inside, snow still on his coat, eyes tired but bright. He held out a small paper bag. "I brought scones, still warm." "You made them?" she teased. "I bribed the baker downstairs." She laughed, the sound filling the room like music. They ate by the window, watching the snow melt in thin silver threads down the glass. For a while, they didn't speak. There was no need. Finally, Maggie said, "It's strange, isn't it? The world starts over every year, yet most of us are afraid to." Edward nodded. "I used to think starting over meant erasing everything before. Now I think it means carrying what still matters and letting the rest melt away." "Then you're learning fast," she said, smiling. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "With a good teacher. One with a good teacher." Later that afternoon, they walked through the square. Children built snowmen near the fountain. The scent of roasted nuts drifted through the air. Someone played an old accordion tune, cheerful and off-key. They stopped near a street vendor selling small carved ornaments. Maggie pointed to one shaped like an open book. "For the shop window," she said. Edward paid for it and turned it over in his hands. Etched on the back were the words, "New chapters begin quietly." He smiled. "That seems about right." At dusk, they returned to the church hall where it had all begun. The decorations were half taken down. Volunteers swept confetti from the floor. The place smelled of pine and candle wax. Ruth spotted them and grinned. "Well, look who found their way back." Maggie hugged her friend. "Some roads are worth retracing." Edward handed Ruth an envelope. "A small donation," he said, "for the library. No headlines, no signatures." Ruth took it, eyes glistening. "You two are good for each other." Maggie glanced at Edward. "We're learning to be." That evening they walked home through the falling snow. The street lamps cast halos of light around them. Inside the shop, the wooden angel glimmered in the window. Edward paused to look at it. "It found its light again," he murmured. "So did we," she answered. He turned to her. "Maggie Hayes, may I be part of whatever chapter comes next?" She smiled, eyes shining. "Only if you promise not to proofread every page." "I can try," he said, laughing. They went inside. The fire burned low, and the room smelled of books, cinnamon, and peace. Edward set a record on the old player, a gentle tune from another time. He offered his hand. "One last dance before midnight becomes memory?" Maggie nodded. "Why not?" They moved slowly across the worn floorboards, the music mingling with the whisper of snow outside. No grand promises, no dramatic vows, just 2 people swaying in quiet gratitude for the miracle of having found each other at last. When the song ended, he kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For letting me believe again." Later, when the lights were dim and the fire only embers, Maggie opened the shop ledger to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "New year, new chapter. Partnership established with Langford. Inventory, hope restored." She closed the book and smiled. Outside, the first stars appeared above the city, and through the window the angel caught their glimmer, its small wooden wings reflecting the light of a love born not from youth or chance, but from courage. Have you ever found love or peace after you thought your story was already written? Share your reflections in the comments. Sometimes your story helps someone else begin theirs.